world has gotten dangerous, hasn't it? It's the most dangerous we as a living people have ever seen. There are very few people left that remember World War II, and I wonder if they ever thought they would see World War III. If you are anywhere close to my age, you won't have any problem remembering the fear tactics of the Cold War. Many a classroom practiced nuclear attack drills where they would have you get under your desk to protect you from the window glass blowing into the classroom. Was there ever a real imminent threat of nuclear attack in West Alexandria, Ohio, a very rural Mayberry kind of town in 1967? Wright Patterson wasn't too far away, and I guess if we could put a rocket on the moon and the evil Soviets could circle the globe with theirs, then what chance did we have in Little Town, USA? People took it seriously, though. We knew about Korea, even though it was before I was born, but that really wasn't a war, was it? That so called police action cost the lives of 2.5 million Koreans. Most were non combatants. Over 36,000 young Americans lost their lives in what many felt was not even a legal engagement. Vietnam was right on the heels of that, and almost 60,000 American men died at the average age of 19. There were 2 million Vietnamese that died. As with any war, civilian losses far exceeded military losses, all for a cause that is still unclear. But what was clear about those and other so-called engagements was that they were not declared acts of war. They were not constitutional and offered little to no strategic advantage to the United States or its citizens. Has anybody ever stopped and asked why the US has been fighting for 228 of 245 years? There has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 engagements by the United States military and only 11 declarations of war from Congress, the last one being World War II. Despite Ike's military background and being the only general to be elected president in the 20th century, he warned the nation with regard to the corrupting influence of what he described as the military-industrial complex.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
But how many of us really know what that means? What it should mean is if we need battle tanks like the M1 Abrams to defend our nation, we create a factory such as General Dynamic Land Systems to produce them, and that's where it should end. But it doesn't. General Dynamics is not a government entity, but rather a publicly traded company that the taxpayer paid the startup cost as well as any production cost, which is about $10.5 million to make just one of the M2. Not a bad deal for General Dynamics. No production cost, and they keep the profits, but not so good for Americans. A publicly traded company answers to its stockholders, whether it's consumer products or defense contractors like General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, AT, General Electric, Boeing, or any of the large funds investing in them like BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street. It is a war for profit on the backs of the American public. And since there are only so many tanks, missiles, or other armaments we need to protect our homeland, and only so many that NATO countries require to protect theirs, they do what any profit-driven company does. They create an open market. This open market doesn't see our best, though. For instance, we didn't send the M2 Abrams tank to Ukraine. We sent the cheaper M1s because we couldn't risk the M2s with their advanced armor falling into Russian hands, or so the Pentagon says. It is more likely that they are easier to blow up so you can make money on the replacements. The actual cost doesn't matter, though, because you're paying for them anyway. That last round of $60 billion won't go to Ukraine. At least most of it won't, if it ever gets released at all. That money goes to defense contractors like Raytheon, General Dynamics, AT&T, Lockheed Martin, and a whole host of other contractors and subcontractors who in turn pump millions back into DC. Oh, there'll be just enough to keep the Ukrainian government functioning and pay for the military for a little while anyway, but everyone knows the well has dried up on both sides. The mighty military-industrial complex cannot make any more money off Ukraine right now, and once the colonels and generals figure out there's no more money to skim, if they don't turn their weapons on Kiev and force a surrender, they will be on their way to Cyprus, Bahamas, Florida, or wherever they have their pilfered golden parachute stashed courtesy of Uncle Sugar, and the fight at that point will be over if Russia hasn't finished them off by then. That's just one weapon system that we have on the open market, and NATO or anyone else with the money is the market. NATO is a military alliance, of course, and in nearly every way, USA is NATO. So when it comes time to shop for arms, they shop at the NATO swap meet, for lack of better terms. Tanks, missiles, radar systems, you name it, you'll find it there if you have the money. It doesn't matter if the product is not fit for battle, such as the F-35 junk strike fighter, which is vastly inferior to the F-22 Raptor and the Su-57 from the Russians. We stopped production of the F-22 in 2012, where we still have 182 of them, but that's all we're getting from Lockheed Martin. And fortunately, none of those have been exported. Lockheed Martin is now focused on the broader market, the world market, where the big money is, hence the F-35. Point is that the United States does not make weapons for national defense. We make them for the open market, for profit. Victoria Nuland gives you a peek here, but it's hardly the entire picture.
Well, first on Europe protecting itself, all of us have to invest not only in Ukraine's fight, but in rebuilding our own defense industrial bases, because we have, given so much to Ukraine, and we've also understood that some of these systems that we thought we would never need, 155 artillery, are clearly still part of the kit. So the fact that, as I said, with regard to our own package, so much of it goes right back into the US economy to replace and allow us to send other stuff to Ukraine. It serves a threefold purpose, right? It helps Ukraine, it provides jobs in the United States, and it serves as an economic stimulus. And I think countries like Germany are starting to see the same requirement. And so that is a good thing.
She's only half lying. The money does come back to the United States, not to you though. They don't create new jobs, but rather only feed the corporations, their stockholders, and of course your favorite politician. Isn't it ironic that the only actual people making direct money are literally making it from stealing, whether it's Zelensky, his cabinet, and officers skimming for their inevitable defeat, or the politicians with their payoffs, defense contractors, and PAC contributions? I have a video in the mix spelling it all out and who benefits. It isn't as complicated as you think it is. Of course, peace is antithetical to the mighty military industrial war industry, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that our own government has become masters at creating an arms market by destabilizing nations, regime change initiatives, proxy wars, and wrecking economies via the SWIFT banking system. The CIA and other so-called secret organizations in the hopes of removing the last vestiges of Western competition. It doesn't matter that they pose no threat to us as a nation as long as the neocons in DC and their sponsored press corps keep presenting false threats. Why would we ever need a real one? Mitt Romney stood up in front of everyone with this mouthful of babble.
But if your position is being cheered by Vladimir Putin, it's time to reconsider your position. What sending weapons to Ukraine does do is help discourage further Russian and Chinese invasions, which could draw us in. It helps preserve NATO. It allows America to remain the leader of the free world. And it shows that we honor our word to our friends and allies. Lech Walesa, the first democratically elected president of Poland since 1926, recently wrote to all the United States senators. He said this, quote, "You're obliged to assure a peaceful future for your children. Our grandchildren will never forgive us if we fail to stop Russia now. If the U.S. does not lead, nobody will. Helping a free people defend their freedom is simply the right thing to do."
There is more, but does anyone know what this guy is talking about? Who wrote that for him? The vice president? How does that make any sense at all to anyone that has even an inkling of understanding of China? The only way China is a threat to the United States is economically. And China's economy isn't in the greatest shape right now, but they have made themselves the world's manufacturer of consumer goods like iPhones and televisions. They did not steal that, though. We handed our manufacturing base to them along with our technologies, and they ran with it. China does not want to do anything to interfere with their recent market economy, especially something as stupid and costly as war. If we want a manufacturing base that competes with China, perhaps we should be investing there instead of startups. Who exactly needs another app? No, I don't see anything that directly indicates China as a threat to the United States at all. Besides, their military has only been tested twice in what amounts to minor border skirmishes. Both lasted about 6 months and both resulted in defeat. Russia in 1969 and Vietnam in 1979, and their current military is clearly developed for the defense of their own borders. I know a few armchair politicians and even a few civilian generals that disagree with Chinese humanitarian policies or how they run their government. But if we were being honest, myself included, we know next to nothing about China And even if we did, it's China, for goodness sake. It has nothing to do with the welfare and liberty of the people of the United States. We only know what we have been told and shown by legacy media. If I were dared to believe my own eyes, I'd have to say the only real conflicts China has ever had in their 3,500 year of history were entirely internal. Government overthrows, etc. They have expressed zero interest in expansion beyond their own borders, and there is no evidence that they plan to invade Taiwan. There is absolutely no evidence that China has ever interfered with American elections, nor has anyone ever produced a single shred of evidence that China was at the core of any false information campaigns. You can decide for yourself how or to what end controlling the narrative about China serves, but I think we owe it to ourselves and our legacy to seek to understand rather than let ourselves be manipulated just because we believe those telling the story, like Nikki Haley, know more than we do. Well, I'm telling you, they don't. They don't even try. They only peddle hate and fear. But as a people, we must. Take a look at your sons and daughters. Do you love and cherish them? Of course you do. Doesn't it make sense that Chinese people love and cherish their children? Doesn't it make more sense that they, like us, want their children to grow up and love and cherish their own children? Doesn't it make more sense that China would rather have peaceful relations with its number one trading partner? I think people are finally seeing for the first time, the proverbial curtain being pulled back on who the propaganda peddlers really are. Can anyone think of a single reason to trust our government anymore? I know we truly want to trust our government. You can tell by the record number of people showing up to vote. It's not working, is it? Because it seems no matter whom we elect, it has become crystal clear that they are not representing the wishes or the interests of Americans. Does the average American think we should be starting regime change wars all over the world? Does the average American think we should be sending $110 billion and all of our reserve armaments to Ukraine just to get horribly defeated? And 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed and another 200,000 that have been functionally and permanently wounded and will never be normal again, let alone return to battle? All for a country that was and still is seen as the most corrupt country in the world. It was a shameful and futile attempt to weaken Russia. And not only did it backfire, Russia is stronger both economically and militarily than it has been in 30 years, in spite of the crushing sanctions they are under. At least the German military chief was brave enough to say it, but in my opinion, didn't go far enough and tell people about the dismal state of his own military. Putin has shown the world there is life after SWIFT banking system. In 2006, BRICS wasn't expected to be anything more than a novelty, but thanks to the world witnessing how the U.S. wields financial extortion over the countries that participate in the system and how they have no problem stealing money left in their trust, a sovereign country they don't like and giving it to another they do, there are now 40 countries lined up to join BRICS, many of which have never been sanctioned but have seen the devastating effects of anyone on the system that doesn't bend a knee to Western hegemony. For several months now, China has been quietly dumping our long-term treasuries. The current holdings are the lowest since China became a market economy, and other countries are slowly doing the same. If BRICS becomes as successful as it seems the West is making it, there will be more than treasuries coming back home. Imagine all that cash sovereign nations are holding in reserve that loses massive value every single day we continue to print our way into insolvency. There will be no reason to hold as much, if any, currency in reserve anymore, and those currency holdings will be dumped, causing a hellstorm in the foreign exchange or Forex, which will in turn, without a doubt, trigger a massive sell-off of securities in the broader markets. Hamburger, the number one food item purchased by Americans in 2020, was around $3.75 a pound, and today it is over $7 at Safeway. Imagine that same pound of beef being $20 or even $30 per pound. If the food that Americans consume the most are doubling every 3 years, at what point will we be unable to afford it at all? What will happen to the food suppliers like farmers and ranchers that can no longer operate because nobody can afford their products? We are led to believe that sanctions are a viable alternative to armed conflict, but you can now see one way those sanctions make their way back home. To add insult to injury, Blinken announced it has imposed 500 more sanctions on Russia because of the death of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison, a man that most of us never heard of until almost yesterday. I can assure you, most of that was just hot air anyway, since most of the sanctions are already in place. Besides, the West have highly exaggerated the popularity of Navalny. He never earned more than 5% approval in Russia and remained virtually unknown outside of Moscow. In 2012, he was indicted on charges of embezzlement, which was overturned for lack of evidence. So, in a couple of years, when they had the evidence, it was retried, and Navalny was convicted with a suspended sentence. Right after that, he ran for mayor of Moscow and secured an impressive 27% of the vote. The problem is that number hardly represents the majority of Moscow. Because of electronic ballots and new streamlined paper ballots, 2013 was the highest voter turnout in history with just under 20% of the population voting. What the Western media also fails to mention are the conflicting stories with what was sold as an attempt on Navalny's life in 2020. If there was an attempt on his life, it wasn't with the nerve agent Novichok, like they told the press. First of all, they can't make up their mind if it was in a cup of tea, in a water bottle, or in his underwear. None of which could possibly be true because Novichok cannot be used. Really, I mean it. It is so powerful that even the so-called residue the Germans said they found on the water bottle would have killed everyone on the plane, not to mention the people administering it. I find it curious the so-called evidence of the deadly agent came from the CIA literally immediately upon arrival in Germany. We don't know what made him sick, and maybe we won't. But telling everyone it was the most deadly nerve agent the world has ever seen was a big giant lie. Another thing most didn't know about Navalny was his involvement with the CIA and MI6. People in our government will take it to the grave that he was not, but it isn't a stretch knowing that Yale has always been the fishing grounds for the CIA. Remember Bush Jr. talking about the old skull and bones? So secret you can't talk about it?
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America?
Well, Navalny was invited for a fellowship at Yale in 2010 as a young dissenting lawyer and has done nothing but politics against Putin ever since. It turns out his so-called grassroots organization has its real roots in the United States as well. The press made this guy out to be a real contender for Putin, which is hardly the truth. There are political opponents that are much more of a pain in the ass for Putin, which makes this story all the more suspicious. And if he wasn't a CIA asset, I don't think Russia would be putting him up in a possible prisoner exchange, nor do I think the so-called world leaders and our own president of the United States would be using his death to virtue signal and advance hatred for Russia. It's not as if the CIA were operating in Ukraine at the Russian border or anything like the Times reported. One would think the voice of reason would have prevailed in Western leadership and at least wait for conclusive evidence, but instead we were treated to this.
For more than a decade, Russian government, Putin, have persecuted, poisoned, and imprisoned Alexei Navalny. His death only underscores the weakness and rot at the heart of the system that Putin has built. Russia's responsible for this.
Putin's Russia imprisoned him, trumped up charges against him, poisoned him, sent him to an Arctic penal colony, and now he's tragically died. And we should hold Putin accountable for this, and no one should be in any doubt about the dreadful nature of Putin's regime in Russia.
What we have seen is that Russia has become a more and more authoritarian power, that they have used oppression against opposition for many years.
If confirmed, this would be a further sign of Putin's brutality. Whatever story they tell, let us be clear, Russia is responsible.
Like millions of people around the world, I'm literally both not surprised and outraged by the news. Reported death of Alexei Navalny. Putin had him poisoned. He had him arrested, he had him prosecuted for fabricated crimes, he's sentenced to prison, he was held in isolation. Reports of his death, if they're true, and I have no reason to believe they're not, Russian authorities are going to tell their own story. But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible. We have to provide the funding so Ukraine can keep defending itself against vicious onslaughts and war crimes.
I don't see any reason to doubt the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Budanov's press statement, whom I think we can all agree has every reason to lie about Russia and Vladimir Putin.
Я можу вас розчарувати, але те, що нам відомо, він реально загинув від тромба.
It's not like Vladimir Putin himself didn't expose the CIA in his interview with Carlson either. Our government lies to us all the time, and they have been using the legacy media to do it. Every network news broadcast company is orchestrated together to deliver the exact messaging, and that messaging is not only agenda biased, it seldom even has fragments of the truth anymore. What blows me away is that we all know this, and yet we jump on damn near every first out press release like it's the gospel from God Almighty. To their credit, when some people find out the facts, the truth, they have the intelligence and courage to adjust their positions accordingly. What is equally true is that many people do not change their stance when exposed to factual or contrary information. How on earth does that serve anyone? It's willful ignorance, and it's and it's got to stop. We have to start thinking for ourselves and believing what we see instead of what we have been told. It is time for everyone everywhere, not just Americans, to question every single thing they have been told, especially if it does not align with your own morals and ethics. Americans know we are being lied to constantly, which is why people are looking to independent media for the truth. Since 2018, the internet took over legacy media as our go-to source for news and information, and YouTube has surpassed Google as the #1 search engine because people know that they have a better chance of finding the truth, or at least a narrative that isn't whitewashed by the Beltway and spoon-fed to the propaganda machine, legacy media. The White House will discount everything outside their own narrative as misinformation, but as usual, the neocons that try so hard to convince you that they have their finger on the pulse of America doesn't think you are smart enough to make up your own mind. What America needs is the truth, even if it's bad. We don't need our generals being mouthpieces for their future employers like Milley was when he said this a year ago.
Russia has lost. They've lost strategically, operationally, and tactically, and they are paying an enormous price on the battlefield. But until Putin ends his war of choice, the international community will continue to support Ukraine with the equipment and capabilities it needs to defend itself. Most of the movement is in the vicinity of Bakhmut. It has a very significant grinding battle of attrition with very high casualties, especially on the Russian side.
Bakhmut, the town Milley was talking about, was nothing like that. It was a Russian killing field. Let me tell you something. It wouldn't have hurt Zelensky to have read The Art of War. I say Zelensky because I doubt there's a general or field officer in any military, in any country, that does not have a copy right next to their Bible. General Alexander Pavlyuk, the general that repelled Russians' initial advance without Western weapons, I might add, appeared to know his way around the battlefield, which is why I figured he wasn't calling the shots when they refused to give up any ground in Bakhmut, to fall back and regroup and reinforce their rear. Turns out they didn't even have a rear to fall back to. One of the first things you read and hopefully learn in The Art of War is to know your enemy. Looking back, we now know even we didn't know the Russians as well as we thought. We never thought Russia could manufacture 1 million artillery rounds a year, and they are pumping out over 7 million now. It also came to light that Putin only committed a small force, and to their credit, Ukrainians fiercely fought them off. I guess Putin was hoping that the Ukrainians would just go quietly into the night with just a show of force, but the Russians were shown the door instead. Greed is a very powerful motivator, and Zelensky thought he had an open checkbook for as long as he needed and as many weapons as he needed. The West knew how to play him like a fiddle, and unfortunately for him, and even more for his country that trusted him on his campaign promises of peace, Putin knew how to play him as well. As soon as Putin figured out Pavlyuk was no longer calling the shots, he quickly mastered the art of Zelensky. Once he figured Zelensky had adopted a don't give up an inch of Ukraine territory without knowing how to hold it, it was just simply a matter of strategy to use that against him. In Bakhmut, picture a horseshoe formation surrounding the town with streets deliberately left open for the Ukrainians. Now, they could have either retreated or they could have advanced. They sadly chose the latter, boxing themselves in as targets. The last month of fighting in Bakhmut saw 36,000 Ukrainian soldiers get killed with that strategy. They started with an army of 750,000, so how long can they keep up fighting with those kind of losses? As it is right now, the Ukrainians are redefining what fighting age means. They're grabbing anyone they can right off the streets right now and shoving them into the meat grinder after only about 8 days of training. They don't care how old you are anymore. The average age of the tank driver is 47, with the oldest one around my age. The youngest reported being sent to the front line was about 15, and all of them are terrified. They've seen the obituaries and the funerals just like we have, and they know the losses, and they know if something doesn't change quick, they're going to be next. And they know, sadly, nothing's going to change. They can't desert, they can't surrender because those Azov Nazis the Western media said doesn't even exist are positioned in the rear to make sure that they don't. If they try to desert or surrender, they will be shot right there on the spot by the non-existent Nazis. Imagine sitting in a coffee shop with your family celebrating your 16th birthday and being dragged out against your will, and 8 days later being forced into the reality that you will either die facing the Russians in battle or get shot by the Azovs if you try to run. When I learned they were sending young women to the front, that was it for me. I feel strongly, with very few exceptions, that the battlefield is no place for women. This has nothing to do with women serving. I have no problem with women being fighter pilots, intelligence officers, etc. But when it comes to ground war, the physical demands make it impractical for women and is simply out of the question, even before we get to the higher morality issues of sending women to die in battle, and die they will. Avika has fallen. There's very little to stop Russia from advancing west. It will most likely be at the upper river within a couple of months because it doesn't look like NATO has given Russia a choice. And then the decision will be, what do we do now? Are we going to get some sort of settlement arrangement? Or does the United States, Great Britain, and his friends in Western Europe try to turn Western Ukraine into a guerrilla warfare state that is constantly lobbing missiles or performing acts of sabotage or terror against Russia? No doubt our Washington war whores would love an Afghan-type extended conflict to feed the machine, but I doubt Putin will allow that to happen. Now, if it turns out to be something cannot be resolved, then the Russians have the military power and the capability to go all the way to the Polish border. But that's not something they want to do. Poles don't want it, Russians don't want it, and we shouldn't want them to do it either. Poland is a member of NATO, and that inevitably means American boots on the ground. I don't think the average American wants to go to war with anyone, let alone Russia. And you can see for yourself from the Russian head of state in the Carlson interview, they don't want to go to war with us either. It is clear that the policy of economically sanctioning sovereign nations or bombing them into submission under the false pretense of liberation has not worked. And if we were to be honest, by definition has failed and made the world a very unstable place. The idea that we should expand NATO to encircle Russia for the sole purpose of destroying it is insanity. Every time the US said we wouldn't advance NATO east, they lied and did it anyway. And still we see the Russian head of state, without a teleprompter or even notes, share with the world a point of view few of us have ever heard. And what I heard was the language of peace. The 500 million people that watched the 2-hour interview, I imagine, are asking the question we all are at this point. What are we so pissed at the Russians for? And is this Hatfield-McCoy thing with Russia worth it? If you said no, then I'm with you. It isn't worth the $17 trillion that has caused crushing confiscatory taxation while it makes Washington donors even more rich. And it's definitely not worth the price of millions of innocent lives all over the world that have been extinguished for profit. I'd suggest accepting the olive branch Vladimir Putin extended, and let's see what can be accomplished with the goal of peace in mind. Because when I said the world is getting to be more dangerous than it ever has been, I meant for everyone, including the heretofore insulated United States of America. The legacy news outlets, as a coordinated effort, has done its best to show America always with white hats patrolling the moral high road with the world's best and baddest military to back it up, which up until maybe as late as 2000 was true, at least the military part. Since World War II, we have sat at the head of every table because, well, we won the war. We had military installations already established in every key strategic location across the world, and we had built an incredible manufacturing base at home. By the 1990s, we were untouchable. We had the most technological military the world had ever seen, and every nation state wanted to be a part of it. We had proven stealth bombers, the best fighters, enough nukes to blow up the world several times. We could make the world do what we wanted and never get our hands dirty. Our intelligence operations were so effective we could overthrow a government without ever committing American forces by instigating civil wars, economic hardships through leveraged infrastructure loans, or those famous sanctions for any made-up reason at all. And it worked. For decades, we did as we damn well pleased with impunity because there wasn't a single thing anyone could do about it. Even the mighty USSR couldn't touch us anymore. We had achieved what no nation had before, global land, sea, and air superiority. But that was then. Today, every nation that has not fallen under the complacency of the NATO umbrella, such as France, Germany, and England, has been for the last 30 years consolidating their territories and building their own militaries. Russia today is nearly at full military capacity, and they have several facilities manufacturing arms 24/7. Their initial Ukrainian assault wave has been pulled from the front, retrained, and rested. 50,000 men a month are voluntarily leaving their jobs to take up military pay to defend Mother Russia. 300,000 reservists, which are former soldiers, have been called up and are being retrained, which will bring a total of around 1.2 million Russian troops battle ready by August or September. It should make everyone uneasy. They have stockpiled for 36 months of intense battle, and you should know they didn't do it for Ukraine. Macron said recently at a meeting he hosted that while there is no clear consensus to send troops to Ukraine, it shouldn't be ruled out. On a personal note, I'd like to know what troops he's talking about. Is he talking about his own troops that just got their asses handed to them in Niger? Or maybe he's talking about Germany with their snitchel-eating fat asses trying to maintain of what's left of a decimated military. Or maybe he's talking about England, who is even weaker than France and can't seem to get their Lilliputian navy out of dry dock. It doesn't matter anyway, because it didn't take long for other Western leaders to summarily dismiss the idea and distance themselves publicly because they all know better. Shortly after Macron's ambition got the better of him, Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian General Assembly in what amounts to a State of the Union. In that address, he went on for 2 hours. He wasn't shy about flexing for the West, though.
Заговорили о возможности отправки на Украину натовских военных контингентов. Но мы помним судьбу тех, кто направлял когда-то свои контингенты на территорию нашей страны. Но теперь последствия для возможных интервентов будут гораздо более трагичными. Они тоже есть оружие, да знают об этом, сейчас только я сказал, тоже есть оружие, которое может поражать цели на их территории. И что все они придумывают сейчас, чем пугают весь мир, что все это реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации. Они чего, этого не понимают, что ли?
For those that think the man is bluffing, I humbly ask you to reconsider your error in thinking. Russia has made it clear from the beginning that the deployment of NATO conventional forces to Ukraine would be a red line that would lead to direct conflict with Russia, which would end up in a general nuclear war. The West doesn't believe Russia would ever launch a nuclear strike, and as usual, they haven't thought things through. Sadly, our military is in dire need of a rapid restock, and we have no surge capacity. As it is, we are nearly exclusively an air and sea military, and we don't even know if our missiles even work. We haven't tested anything in decades. Britain just did a test on the aging Triton missile launched from a submarine, which failed for a second time. Lockheed Martin made those, so you had better hope we don't encounter the same projectile dysfunction when we need it. This woke shit in the military has decimated recruitment, and it's just a crack now, but under battle pressure, that crack is going to be a break. I don't know how long it would take to build up our regular infantry for a ground invasion on the other side of the world, but 8 months to a year seems to be the consensus. We have what I call a paper army. Sure, we look good on paper with about 1.2 million in active service across all military branches, and about 450 of those are in the Army. How many men and women in the Army are actual combatants, though? Well, about 80% of all jobs in the military are non-combatant or support roles. Those are kitchen personnel, military police, supply, medical, and many more. But that means we have only about 100,000 combat soldiers on the ready at any given time. It has not escaped my attention that Ukraine has lost more men in combat than we have in the Army. Many people I've spoken to in recent months seem to think we could win by just bombing our opponents into submission, but it just doesn't work that way. Not that NATO or the US has won a war in recent history, unless you count Desert Storm, where we left half the Iraqi army to fight another day and created ISIS in the process. Wars are not won by bombing or air superiority. They are exclusively won on the ground. You can literally bomb a city flat, but if you don't have boots on the ground to secure it, you have done nothing but flatten a city. If it were 1991, we would have no problem fighting on multiple fronts, but today's opponent has been preparing for decades to take on the West in a ground battle, and the West has done very little in the way of fortifying our ground forces and next to nothing for air defenses. Recruitment is down to where we have just eliminated 24,000 positions that we cannot fill. That may look like, instead of 18 howitzers in a battalion, maybe we eliminate one battery and have only 12 guns, hollowing out the military. They have been able to meet certain recruitment requirements for support jobs by lowering some of the standards, but the one area cannot be compromised are the combat units. Combat units require fit, strong, well-disciplined, and motivated men. That's right, men, not trans men, men. 24% of Gen Z doesn't qualify for military service due to drug, mental, or obesity problems, and the rest have figured out how to make a living and support a new family from home and absolutely refuse to volunteer for a war that they don't agree with or for a government they know is corrupt against enemies they have a good reason to fear, all for about $24K a year. I think the fact that the woke revolution has made its way into the military is indicative of a much larger problem in America as a whole. But where does that leave our national security if we cannot fill our combat roles? So when we ask the question whether or not the Russians will use nuclear force, the answer is yes, but not as a first strike. If NATO puts boots on the ground in Ukraine, it won't take us long to realize that a direct conflict with Russia cannot be won with conventional forces and arms. We will be the first strike, and Russia will retaliate accordingly. And strategically, Russia is an offensive military specifically designed to defeat Western defenses, conventional or nuclear. The Russian Avangard hypersonic missile and Zerk cannot be shot down with our Patriot missile system. The stealth nuclear-powered cruise missile Burevestnik can be outfitted with either conventional or nuclear warheads and can stay aloft indefinitely, virtually undetected below our radar. In the West, we have no equivalent. And as I mentioned earlier, Russia has well-trained, motivated Russian patriots volunteering by the thousands to defend their motherland. One of the hottest things in the news recently was Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir. I have to be honest, I did not expect the pushback that he received. All of us should have expected the comedy talk show host to have a field day with it, and of course, they didn't let us down. It's amazing how much you can slander and discredit someone as long as you do it in the name of comedy. But when someone in your very own profession, essentially the same job you are, says you and your entire career of journalism since 1995 doesn't make you a journalist just because you interviewed a foreign head of state, begs the question, why?
Putin is trying to court the MAGA GOP in the United States. In fact, one of the leaders of the MAGA GOP is in Moscow tonight. It's the man you see here, Tucker Carlson, possibly there in Moscow to interview Putin, definitely there as a Putin-supporting celebrity. Just listen to how Russian state media is breathlessly celebrating his visit.
Independent journalist Tucker Carlson has flown to Russia from the U.S. via Turkey to Vnukovo Airport. He saw Spartacus Ballet at the Bolshoi Theater, had lunch in a nice restaurant, went for a ride around town, rode the subway. He charged his smartphone via a USB port and connected to a fast and free Wi-Fi internet.
Look at them talking about him like a celebrity. Everything he does on camera, breathlessly repeated. Now, it is unclear if an interview between Putin and Carlson will take place, but if it does, it gives Putin a chance to sit down with a big supporter.
It might be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about? Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Does he eat dogs? These are fair questions, and the answer to all of them is no. Vladimir Putin didn't do any of that.
I'll actually always remember watching that clip. I was standing in Ukraine 48 hours before the war began there. Well, Carlson then stood by Putin consistently all the way through. And that is why he can go to Moscow now without any fear of being summarily imprisoned. He's a hero. This was Putin's mouthpiece in the United States, somebody who had turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed by Putin because they were happening far away.
What is it they don't want us to find out? That maybe Putin isn't the monster the Washington press corps made him out to be? That maybe we have been lied to yet again? That unfortunately doesn't compare with what this former senator and United States presidential candidate couldn't resist revealing about herself.
Tucker Carlson is in Moscow right now interviewing Vladimir Putin.
Right.
The first American, I'll say, journalist to interview Putin since the war in Ukraine began. What does that tell you about Tucker Carlson and right-wing media and also Vladimir Putin?
Well, it shows me what I think we've all known. He's what's called a useful idiot. I mean, if you actually read translations of what's being said on Russian media, they make fun of him. I mean, he's like a puppy dog. You know, he somehow has, after having been fired from so many outlets in the United States, I would not be surprised if he emerges with a contract with a Russian outlet, because he is a useful idiot. He says things that are not true. He parrots Vladimir Putin's pack of lies about Ukraine. So I don't see why Putin wouldn't give him an interview.
Keep in mind, this was before the interview. Did you notice how convenient it was for her to accuse him of being a Putin puppet? Now, where have I heard that one before? She not only calls him a useful idiot, but goes on to call him a liar and also the Russian head of state a liar. Is it true, though? Is the Russian president a liar? Or was it just Clinton's feeble attempt to dissuade people from finding out for themselves? Well, it certainly did anything but. 500 million people took 2 hours out of their life to gain some insight that did not come from one of the state-sponsored propaganda machines. Of course, every journalist and YouTuber had an opinion about how the interview should have been conducted. Tucker himself confessed to being underprepared, and Putin said in a later interview he had hoped for a more spirited conversation, but what did we get? We'll never know if Carlson was in over his head or if it was a clever move to yield the floor to the Russian president. I'm going to go with the latter, because not only has he been trying for years to get an interview with him, but he also knows the risks associated with going to Russia and interviewing the Russian head of state right now, because as far as Washington is concerned, we're at war with Russia. We have not declared war, but we're doing everything short of committing our air, ground, and naval forces to the fight. In spite of all that, these two men agreed to an interview, and everything I heard from Putin I found to be true and accurate. It's clear Putin deliberately distanced himself from communism and the USSR, and rightfully so. As Putin himself said, communism is the past. Now they have a market economy, and they're as bourgeois as we are. Sooner or later, though, Russia will have to come to terms with its communist past. It's a dark cloud on Russia's past, and that isn't taught today in the Russian classroom. Maybe there is somebody's grandfather that's still alive to talk about Stalin, but if you think Hitler was bad, Stalin killed 16 times the number of people the Nazis did, but nobody in Russia wants to talk about it. It's a lot like the people born in Israel that think the land was vacant before they got there. Well, it wasn't. It isn't that the Russians lie to their citizens like the Israelis do. They just don't talk about it. They need to, though, because the Russian version of communism is a critical element of World War II and the rise of Hitler. The Germans knew all about the people being starved to death in Ukraine in an orchestrated famine that killed nearly 10 million people, and there was every reason at the time to believe they were next. Millions more were killed when Stalin overran Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and half of Finland, as well as nearly half of Poland. Now, while these countries may not teach this history either, for all I know, but I bet you they know about it. Ask any Pole, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian about the Russian gulags, and I'm sure they all have a relative that was killed in the forced labor camps. The gulags were in the coldest parts of Russia, and millions died from exposure. The majority of Hitler's campaign was centered around anti-communism, so without communism, there would have been no Hitler, or he would have had to find some other way to win. So while Putin may be comfortable with glassing over 73 years of the darkest of Russia's history, the world isn't so quick to forget. Don't get me wrong. What Russia has been able to do under the leadership of Vladimir Putin is nothing short of amazing, and he enjoys an 80% approval amongst the population for it. Under his watch, he brought his country through a depression that was every bit as bad as ours in the 30s and built a military that no one ever expected, restored the Orthodox Christian Church, and exiled the oligarchs, bringing a real sense of pride and Russian identity. I found Vladimir Putin logical and sincere in the Carlson interview. His claim of extending olive branches throughout several administrations checks out, as well as his protest against the different NATO expansions into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the worst expansion was Poland is notorious for hating communist Russia. And of course, Ukraine was the last straw for Russia. In the interview, Putin shared there was a partially signed agreement that would have allowed Ukraine to keep most of its territory except for the Russian-speaking Crimea and Donbass, but the United States wasn't having any of that peace business.
Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine without provocation, without justification.
On Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine.
The prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine tonight as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack.
Russia commenced its full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine.
President Putin has launched a horrific, unprovoked attack on their country.
We are united in condemning the unprovoked aggression.
No justification apart from the fact that he is a warmonger that wanted to build an empire.
Is the aggressor. Putin chose this war.
After all, there's no money in peace for the United States military-industrial complex, so they sent Boris Johnson in to put a stop to it. The U.S. offered unlimited military support and lots of cash. Intelligence reports show trucks under armed escort going into Poland, no doubt carrying the corrupt field colonels' and generals' golden parachutes for after the war. So how much really got to where it was supposed to? Some are saying as much as a third of the armaments, especially missiles, ended up on the open market, and only a third of the cash reached its intended destination. There are even reports that a Javelin missile was spotted across our own southern border in the hands of the cartel. How did that get there? That's another video. As Putin asked Carlson in the interview, why? Why is the United States in Eastern Europe at all? After all, we have a border crisis and we are $34 trillion in debt. He said 33, but saying exactly the same thing that every patriotic American asked that hasn't sold out to Agenda 2030 and the lost woke revolution. He asked, what's your interest here? Why are you doing this? You have other fish to fry, so to speak. In other words, why are you meddling in the internal affairs of others? And that's what we've been doing for 78 years, and it's got to stop. The justification for meddling is nearly always, you're not sufficiently democratic. Well, I think a lot of people are looking at the United States today and are wondering about our republic and just how democratic it is. That's another subject, but there was a time when the United States led by example and were the envy of everyone. Our model of capitalism was something to be emulated, and many nations did just that. You could go anywhere in Europe and Asia in the 80s and 90s and see signs of early westernization in nearly every aspect of social society. We didn't have to export American free enterprise at gunpoint. People wanted it and were making it for themselves. So if people around the world were Americanizing themselves, at least in terms of free enterprise, the only motivation that makes any kind of sense is greed. $850 billion, now closer to $1 trillion, is on the line for defense contractors, and they don't mind spending millions in what amounts to bribes to get billions. Don't get me wrong. America has strength, and its people and natural resources are at the very core of that strength. Because of that, our brand as a whole hasn't suffered that much, meaning the world still believes in us in spite of our flaws. Putin pointed out that there is no perfect society and we all have our flaws. And if we are being honest about our past, our flaws have cost more lives than any other since World War II. If America ever had humility, there are no signs of it now, as it seems false hubris, arrogance, and ignorance are in its stead. The international community has always known this, but it is a reality that Americans are only now waking up to. Another thing that stood out to me was the possibility of theatrics aside. Putin seemed genuinely confused why NATO and the United States haven't tried harder to seek peace and to end conflict. I don't think I could muster a room full of Americans outside of Washington that would not have chosen peace instead of sending a single dime to the most corrupt country in Europe, let alone the whopping $110 billion and counting so far. Now, Boris Johnson and many more in our own government are saying that Tucker Carlson is a traitor to humanity and to the West.
Around the world are watching that ludicrous interview with Vladimir Putin conducted by Tucker Carlson, and we must not fall for this tissue of lies above for the notion that Putin fated to succeed in Ukraine. On the contrary, he is doomed to fail. Read about it in the Daily Mail.
Maybe Boris is just trying to absolve himself of 500,000 people dead because of his interference. 100 million people knew those peace deals were happening, and they know the United States and the United Kingdom blew those to kingdom come. A lot of people criticize Putin's long rendition of Russia's history, and obviously I wasn't without an opinion, but let's not lose sight of his intended message. And it's a message we could all learn a lesson from. Russia is an old country. It's 5 times older than the United States. They have endured terrible wars over many centuries, and not all those wars have gone well for Russia. Millions have died and millions have suffered, but at the end of the day, the Russian state remains. He's making it clear that Russians are not going anywhere. Throughout his presidency, he has never had less than a 70% approval along with his administration or the so-called special military operations in Ukraine. Current polls show Putin at an 80% approval. When was the last time we saw an American politician, let alone a president, with an approval percentage like that? He is also sending a strong message that Russians cannot be divided into small sections and ruled by the West. Russia has reemerged in the 21st century with a solid national identity and a pride that is centered in their definition of democracy and the rule of law. We, on the other hand, and you know I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, are selling this diversity as our strength, and it's killing us. Diversity can be a strength, but only if that diversity is centered around a single idea. In our country, that idea is the Declaration of Independence, and to a lesser extent, the Bill of Rights, because regardless of your national origins, our Constitution starts with the individual and extends outward instead of the other way around. It says that everyone has the unalienable right to life, which should be obvious because, well, you're alive. Also, it is self-evident that we have the right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't matter where you come from, and it's an easy idea to get behind. For generations, the United States was referred to as a melting pot because of that. It was and still is a country that was built on the idea of self-governance and the rights of the individual as its foundation. Sure, we had cultural contributions, but eventually everyone just melted into the identity of American. Case in point, how many people named Murphy still speak Gaelic? I know first-generation Japanese that can only understand their parents but can't speak Japanese fluently in return, and they're fine with that because they think of themselves as Americans, and so do I. In 21st century America, we are told that diversity means we have to adopt every single nuance or oddity that comes our way, no matter how uncomfortable it is, or even how it defies our own logic and even our own morals. There seems to be a real effort to undermine our national identity, culture, and even our many religions. Those are the things that make up the national identities of most states, countries, and most people in the world. We've watched ours diluted to the point now where national monuments, many of which were put up after the Civil War as a means of reconciliation between the North and South, are being dismantled and destroyed, where monuments to Lincoln, to Jefferson, and Washington and others are being defaced or being completely removed. We stand around and shake our heads in disgust, but we let our governments do these things. We have lost sight of the fact that we, the people, are the magistrates, and the government only serves by consent of the magistrates, the people. And the people need to wake up to the fact that we are not without power, but are the very source of the government's power. We can and we must remove our consent to this rogue war machine we call the United States government. Let's turn our attention to Israel now. No, we don't have to talk about the horrors or even try to define it. The International Court of Justice did that for us already. But we didn't need them to tell us what we already know, did we? The entire world knows of the Netanyahu genocide, but what we may not know is how that contributes to the most dangerous time the world has ever seen. Russia isn't the only country over the last 30 years that has modernized and fortified their military. Americans have been led to believe that the only power in the Middle East is Israel. That has proven to be untrue. Even Israel is not the superpower we all thought it was. It has been exposed as a military that can only bomb indiscriminately, demonstrating absolutely nothing in the way of military tactics. If you were to compare Israel's campaign with Ukraine, you would see a vastly different approach to tactics and intention. Ukraine, in spite of 500,000 soldiers being killed, has surprisingly few civilian casualties reported even by the Ukrainians. We can estimate somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Ukrainian civilians lost over the last 2 years compared to Netanyahu's 30,000 civilians in just a few months without any real evidence that Qassam is even weakened at all. Netanyahu says there are 24 brigades in Al-Qassam and the IDF supposedly eliminated all but 4, but I doubt that is little more than the usual Israeli propaganda and probably don't know what they're talking about. They tried to create a buffer zone between Israel and Khan Yunis, but it's clear Israel is still taking losses in the areas they said was cleared. The IDF hasn't exactly been forthcoming in their death count either, but we know they are taking losses at higher than acceptable rates. We have counted over 2,000 medevac airlifts with multiple wounded on board, which, by the way, I'd like to point out, they were not targeted by Hamas. We have no way of knowing Al-Qassam's losses, but we do know the civilian losses have topped 30,000. 40 if you want to count the ones that haven't been found. This type of destruction and lack of any restraint from IDF on the ground shows this can only come from leadership. And leadership in Israel have openly demonstrated their intentions. Putin's targets were strategic and precise, showing a value for human life. That makes sense because he sees Ukrainians as fellow Slavs, if not even fellow Russians. Netanyahu is enraged and shows he clearly hates Palestinians and wants them gone, dead if necessary. And it's going to cost him. It's going to cost them everything, including Israel as we know it. They have been open about their intentions of a so-called biblical greater Israel that doesn't just stop at Gaza and the West Bank. If you look at their maps of the envisioned greater Israel, it includes most of Jordan, a big chunk of Syria, and all of Lebanon. Do they have the ability to accomplish those goals? Let's break it down. Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, has managed to hurt trade with Israel by turning back ships bound for Israel at the Gulf of Aden. The press would have you believe that the world trade is being hurt, but as you can see from the marinetraffic.com, that plenty of shipping is going on, and it is only Israel that has been impacted. In my opinion, you can try to bomb these cowboys in the Middle East into submission, but they're very mobile and impossible to target. Any bombing there is just a show of force for the camera. The terrain won't allow for a ground invasion, and the bombs the U.S. are using are very expensive, so NATO will probably just stick to defending the Gulf. As long as ships are willing to chance the NATO so-called coalition of forces gauntlet, the Houthis will be busy trying to stop them. For the record, Iran did not want the Houthis to attack, but there is no telling the Yemenis what to do. The next on the list is Lebanon. Lebanon is largely governed by Hezbollah, and their military numbers are well over 100,000, but it does not have an air force. Hezbollah possesses limited numbers of anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles, as well as thousands of anti-tank missiles, which they are very skilled at using. They are the only military to defeat Israel twice. The 2020 destruction of Beirut is still fresh in Nasrallah and the Lebanese people's mind, and it isn't excited about the current escalation, but they have the means to defend themselves, and I doubt they will wait for the fight to come to them. I'm sure they will attack northern Israel preemptively if Netanyahu follows through with the ground attack on Rafah. It won't be without a cost on both sides, but Israel will suffer the most. They will lose all of northern Israel, most likely all the way to Galilee. Israel and the neocons in Washington has been itching for a fight with Iran for a long time. Netanyahu, as well as others, see Iran as the cause of all of their problems. Ali Khamenei does indeed support smaller states with money, arms, and training, but made it clear Iran does not give orders to Hamas or Hezbollah, and they clearly stated they don't give attack orders to Houthis. Since Israel wouldn't stand a chance in a fight with Iran, as it has one of the largest and modern militaries in the world and ranks 14 out of 145, the real question should be, can the United States stand toe-to-toe with Iran in an armed conflict? The answer is not at this time. It seems everyone is convinced Iran doesn't have nukes. I think they're wrong. I think Iran just may be real good at keeping secrets, but they don't have to, though. Not only do we know that Pakistan has Iran's back with sufficient nuclear capability to completely wipe out Israel, Even without nukes, we know Iran has a massive supply of missiles that could flatten Israel several times over, and their ground forces are highly trained. I should emphasize, however, that Iran has expressed strong sentiments towards avoiding war. Since becoming a full BRICS member state in January, they would like to get on with the business of stabilizing Iran and making it and other members of the gold-backed economic alliance prosperous. However, I believe an all-out Israeli attack on Lebanon would cause Iran to engage, which of course is what Israel wanted all along, because they operate under the assumption that the United States will do the dirty work for them and destroy Iran. We have already spoken about the depleted state of our ground forces, but even if we had a fully trained combat-ready army, logistics is a huge problem. Some strategists believe we could lose upwards of 50% of the forces arriving by sea because everybody has submarines, and everything on the surface, theirs and ours, once escalation reaches critical mass, is a target for those submarines. Nobody says it out loud for obvious reasons, but behind closed doors, everyone knows in today's Navy you have two types of vessels: submarines or targets. That doesn't look good for a sea landing, and everyone in the area has spent billions on their air defenses, so you can count on a significant loss from troop transport from the air as well. But it isn't just the Yemeni, Lebanese, and Iranians that Israel and the United States has to contend with in a larger regional conflict, is it? What has gotten little coverage lately was the meeting between President Sisi of Egypt and President Erdogan of Turkey. I imagine it was to bury the decade-old rivalry for the common good. What is that common good? The citizens of both countries, as well as Iran, are bursting at the seams for their governments to take action to stop the slaughter of thousands of fellow Arab Muslims in Gaza. President Erdogan is seen as the leader of the Islamic Brotherhood in both and the United States, and has been very outspoken about the genocide in Gaza. But since Turkey is a member of NATO, it has largely been assumed that talk is all he would do, but that seems to be changing. I would not count on Turkey's continued participation in NATO. And if Erdogan leaves NATO, he has the world's 8th largest military. Egypt's military is almost as large as Iran and have mobilized forces at the Rafah crossing and other strategic locations in anticipation of Israel's escalation. Every single Arab nation sees Israel as the reason there is instability in the Middle East and would love nothing less than to see Israel disappear. Israel has had 78 years to become a contributing member nation of the Middle East, and all they have done was to wage war. Netanyahu has placed himself in a position that he has no choice but to escalate. If he doesn't, he has to capitulate, most likely go to jail. As it is, Zionism is finished, hopefully for good. The only question that remains is, will the nation state of Israel remain? So let's add it all up so we can wrap this up for you. Right now, if NATO and the neocons in Washington could get their way, we could realistically be facing the world's largest militaries: Russia, Lebanon, Iran, Egypt, Palestine, and even Turkey. We still maintain the appearance of air and sea superiority, but the cracks in our defenses are being exposed. We now know the Middle East is not only prepared for conflict with Israel, they've been preparing for decades, and we have vastly underestimated their capabilities. Same for Russia. If the United States enters direct conflict with Russia, the entire world will suffer. There is a small hope of keeping the Middle East regional, but if Israel loses militarily, there are Israeli submarines out there with nukes to carry out the Samson option. I don't care who launched the first nuclear strike, because as soon as they do, before it ever finds its target, everybody will launch, because if they don't, they figure they won't be able to after that. Even if nuclear weapons never get used, the United States of America is in no position to fight on even one front, let alone several, with the largest armies in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, American patriots and patriots worldwide, whether you are from France, Germany, Russia, Egypt, or even Israel, our governments are smoking cigars in gas stations all across the planet and have made it as dangerous as it has ever been. They have gone rogue and no longer serve you. It is time for all of us, all over the world, to expose our increasingly despot governments for the lying, cheating warmongers they are and replace them. It is time to dissolve NATO and end the endless wars started by them. It is costing more than lives. It is costing us our very country. We are now paying $1 trillion a year just to service the $34 trillion debt that our government has racked up supporting this military-industrial complex. Anybody that doesn't see this as a house of cards will change their mind when accountability comes knocking. And deep in the privacy of our minds, we all know it will come knocking. The factual truth is the only real threat to the United States of America is at our borders. That's it. Every single threat about China, Russia, and even Iran is a lie and presented to you here specifically for the purpose of supporting this godforsaken military industrial complex to enrich its donors. There have been nothing in the way of strategic or economic advantages to the nation or its people in the 400 military actions taken over the years. And the only people that ever benefited were the stakeholders in the military industrial complex and the politicians they bought. People everywhere deserve better. People are waking up everywhere, Canada, France, Germany, Israel, and beyond, to the fact that their governments are dirt and are now openly defying them. Join us next time when we uncover how the military industrial complex works and how it enriches donors and politicians alike. Until then, aloha.